Chapter 3. Daddy's Girl. Those nights remain vivid in my memory. After my mum and my siblings had gone to bed, I would sneak downstairs and curl up next to my dad on the couch. We would watch movies long past bedtime, sometimes right into the early hours of the morning, even on school nights. I always checked, out of respect, to make sure it was all right for me to stay instead of going back to bed. And he would grin and say, "Ah, darling, get you over here. Just don't tell your ma." Those were precious times, the kind you do not realize you're storing away until years later, when remembering them warms you from the inside. Dad always stayed up later than everyone else. The pain likely stemmed from injuries he sustained, including a fall through a collapsed full flight of stairs that gave way during a fire while he was working as a firefighter. The fall fractured his spine. He moved gracefully and never complained, but you could feel it in the way he shifted or paused. That silent bracing was something only a person who lives with pain every minute truly understands. He carried it the same way he carried everything else, quietly. Losing his ability to work meant more than losing employment. It was the loss of the role that made him feel he was protecting his family from uncertainty. Forced into early retirement from the London Fire Brigade, something in him shifted. He never said it outright, but I could see the fracture beneath the surface. The work had meant everything to him. Talking about the brigade made his countenance radiant and his face light up. His being home gave us something most families do not get: time. He was there for school runs, camping trips, and long afternoons that stretched into evenings of tea and television. It cost him personally, but it gave us a childhood built around presence rather than absence. I remember being tiny, too small to understand much, but hearing my parents in a heated, panicked discussion one night. My mum kept saying, "What are we going to do? What's our plan?" They did not think I could hear, and they definitely did not think I would remember. But I do. Supporting 5 children became difficult when the man shouldering the financial burden faced altered circumstances. Despite everything, I felt fortunate that he was home for most of our childhood. I cherished our strolls into town. In Europe, walking is a way of life. Narrow lanes, footpaths and markets tucked between old stone buildings. Not like America, where you often need a car just to hop to the nearest shop. Back home, my dad and I would slip out for a walk and a chat while my mum handled the chaos of the rest of the clan. Those walks were our secret space. The two of us, talking about nothing and everything, and somehow always coming home feeling like the world had steadied itself again. By the time I had grown and married, life had already carried me across the world. My first husband, TJ, and I were living in Asia when we flew back to the UK for Christmas. The moment I saw my dad at the airport, something in me tightened. He was thinner than I had ever seen him. Smaller somehow. I hate to say it, but fragile looking. That was the opposite of my dad. He had never been a tall man, but his strength lived in his arms and shoulders. The man standing in front of me felt like a faded version of himself. His skin had taken on that unmistakable yellow hue. Jaundice. His National Health Service appointment was already confirmed. We did not need the long, drawn-out details. The diagnosis came quickly. Pancreatic cancer. A few months, they said, just like that. Christmas that year felt strange. Some of the family understandably fell into grief immediately. The house felt heavy, as if whispers and careful conversations had replaced laughter. I resist dwelling in sorrow. I want to live the moments that are still here, not bury them under fear of what is coming. My father handled it the same way he handled everything else. Calm, grounded, as a matter of fact. In his house in Wales, he called each of us in, one at a time. The kitchen door would close. There were no spouses or siblings, and no mum, just dad and one child at a time. It was no dramatic or ceremonial, just deeply personal. It felt sacred in a way that is hard to describe. Throughout all the years till then, I had never seen my father cry. Not once. Not during all the late-night movies, all the walks, all the hard years. Never. But once the dust settled and the reality sank in, each of us had our own private moment with him. When it was my turn, he reassured me the same way he always had. He told me everything would be all right, that it was just time catching up with him, that he and God were good. And then I saw tears in his eyes. For the first time in my life, I did not know what to do. I just sat with him and let him have his space. He apologized for getting sick. That was my dad, taking responsibility for something he never caused. Some brutal disease that does not care who you are. He wanted to make sure everyone else was okay before himself. Then he said something that shaped the rest of my life. He told my husband and me to get back on the plane as planned, to return to Asia. He did not want me to stay in the UK just to watch him die. He was not pushing me away, he was releasing me forward. For my Irish father, he wanted my last memory of him to be that conversation. Just him and his daughter in that kitchen. He wanted me to live, not standing still in grief. And I listened. I returned to Asia, knowing his illness was advancing, but trusting the peace he had already given me in that kitchen. My father passed away at 59. In the end, a massive heart attack incapacitated him and ended what little freedom of health he had. It came near the final stage of his cancer, shortening what little time remained. They moved him to hospice not long after, and as painful as it is to admit, I think he was glad the cancer got him. I know he would not have wanted to live without independence or dignity after the heart attack. He left the same way he lived. I did not return for the funeral. That decision confused some people. It still does. But it was never about avoidance or lack of love. My closure with my father happened in that kitchen, face to face, heart to heart. I had said everything I needed to say, and so had he. Funerals, for me, have always felt like they belong to the living, not to the one who is gone. My way of grieving has always leaned toward remembering someone in joy, rather than gathering in sorrow. I spent that time in Asia, remembering the good things about my dad, the walks, the laughter, the strength he carried through everything life handed him. I have never believed there is one correct way to grieve. Only honest ways. A few months later, once the weight had settled, I returned to Wales to help my mum. 35 years of marriage. He had been her first and only love. Losing him left her unsteady, in a way I had never seen before. I did not go back to sit in sadness, but I went back to help her stand again. The house needed preparing for sale. It was still early in the aftermath of losing him, and my mum was there alone, overwhelmed and slightly adrift. Downsizing became the answer. I handled the practical tasks that feel so strange and unreal after someone dies. There is dismantling, as if one can take apart a life, one document at a time. Working on the house in Wales became something far deeper than preparing a property for sale. At first, it felt practical. A list of jobs, paint the walls, clear cupboards, straighten rooms, make everything look presentable for strangers who would one day walk through it and imagine their own lives within those walls. The house itself was an old Welsh cottage, built from enormous stone blocks that had likely stood for generations. Thick, uneven walls, shaped more by time than by tools, gave it an endurance. Houses like that breathe differently, holding dampness, settling slowly, requiring constant small maintenance to remain strong. My dad had always stayed ahead of those repairs, a tinkerer moving steadily from task to task. Consistent care of the kind most people never notice because it prevents problems before they have the chance to grow. While cleaning and painting, I started noticing places that felt off, corners that my father had patched instead of repaired, paint layered over areas that needed stripping back, small sections where mold and damp had crept through the stone. None of it was catastrophic. The house was not falling apart, but it was not my father's usual standard either. One corner stayed with me. The plaster had bubbled slightly where moisture had pushed through from the outer stone. Someone had painted over it at some point, trying to hide it rather than fix it. I stripped it back to the raw surface. The smell of dampness hit immediately. I scrubbed it down, bleached it, let it dry fully, then filled and sealed it properly with fresh cement before repainting. As I worked, I realized something slowly had settled into me. These were not repairs that my father had ignored for a long time. They had built up, long enough to tell a story without using words. My father had been sicker far longer than he had ever admitted, not because he did not care, not because he had given up. Quite the opposite. I think he simply ran out of strength to stay ahead of everything the way he always had. That realization landed heavier than any diagnosis ever could. He had kept going, protecting and maintaining life around him as long as he physically could. When he could no longer keep pace with it, he never announced it. He simply adapted and carried on. I found small signs of that all over the house, half-finished touch-ups. He started jobs, but never fully completed them. Things my father would normally have taken pride in finishing to the last detail. Each discovery felt like reading pieces of a story he never told out loud. It was not neglect, it was exhaustion, hidden behind dignity. Repairing those areas became strangely emotional without being overwhelming. It felt less like fixing a house and more like finishing sentences he had started. It was a physical way of understanding what he had carried in silence. It felt like standing beside him again, working through problems the way he had always taught me to. My instinct to fix things did not start in Wales. My father believed in teaching by doing. I was about 8 years old the first time he had me helping him with basic car maintenance. While most kids were playing in the street, I was outside with him, learning how to remove tires, check wear patterns, clean and paint wheel hubs, and bolt everything back into place. I was too small to use a wrench properly. The bolts were often tighter than my strength could manage. Instead of doing it for me, he showed me another way. He told me I was just heavy enough to stand carefully on the wrench and use my body weight to loosen the nuts. To this day, I still remember that lesson whenever something feels stuck. There is almost always another way if you will think differently. He taught me how to jack up a car safely and change a tire from start to finish, to saw wood without rushing the blade, to measure twice and cut once. As he worked, he would nod toward the house where Mum was and say that when you treat her the way a woman ought to be treated, she will never let you down. They were basic handyman skills, the kind most people would not have thought to teach a young girl. It simply felt like time spent with my dad. Later, I realized it shaped how my brain learned to solve problems. School rarely worked for me. Structured learning environments often felt like trying to force my mind through a doorway it rarely fit. I processed information visually, physically, and creatively. Sitting still, absorbing information without applying it, felt unnatural and frustrating. Others often misunderstood me as distracted or uninterested. But in reality, I simply learned through experience. Outside the classroom, working with my father made everything click. Problems had solutions you could see and touch. Mistakes were not failures, but adjustments. A broken hinge or stalled engine did not invite panic. It called for assessment, a bit of experimentation, and then firm hands until it worked again. That mindset followed me into adulthood. If I do not have the right tool, I will often find an unconventional way to complete the task anyway. Sometimes it looks unorthodox, sometimes it looks improvised, but it usually works. That willingness to experiment has shaped everything from how I build homes to how I navigate life decisions. Helping my mum repair and prepare the house in Wales felt like stepping back into those early lessons. Each brushstroke, each repair, each cleared cupboard carried echoes of those childhood afternoons learning beside him. It reinforced something that years had built into me. Capability is not about knowing everything. It is about trusting that you can figure things out as you go. That confidence became one of the greatest gifts my father left behind. One morning while I was there, I walked down to the post office. The same walk I had taken countless times with my dad. It felt strange retracing those steps without him. Like the high street itself knew someone was missing. I had paperwork to send for my mother. The woman behind the counter stopped mid-sentence and asked if I was the daughter who lived in Asia. I said yes, confused. She reached across the counter and took my hand. She told me how proud my father was of me, how he spoke about my work overseas, how he brightened her day every time he came in. I started hearing stories like that everywhere. At the bank, staff who had never met me ushered me into the back offices once they realized whose account I was closing. Grown adults stood there with tears in their eyes, telling me how kind he had been, how he always had time for people, how he made ordinary conversations feel important. It turns out my father had left marks on people the way he did everything else. Not loudly, not for recognition, just kindness, repeated over the years. I was protective of my mum, but I also knew she needed to find her footing again in her own way. I stayed for a few weeks, helping where I could, then returned to my life. For the first year after my dad died, I called her 2 or 3 times a week just to check in. Later, she remarried and found happiness again, which is exactly what my dad would have wanted for her. Helping my mom close that chapter of her life also closed part of mine. It took me years to understand that my father did not just shape my childhood. He shaped the way I dealt with loss, risk, and responsibility. Grief, in particular, was something I learned by watching him long before I ever had to face it myself. My father never ignored pain. He simply refused to let it define the rest of his life. That was a very different thing. He acknowledged what hurt him. That distinction would become one of the strongest internal compasses I have ever carried. We only get one life. That was not something he said often out loud, but it lived in how he decided. When something went wrong, he dealt with it. When something ended, he accepted it. He refused to remain fixated on unchangeable situations. Watching that as a child wired something into me. For a long time, I thought that being strong meant being hard. I learned early how to push through discomfort, loss, uncertainty, and fear without pausing long enough to feel what sat underneath it. I became efficient at surviving difficult moments. But survival and living are not the same thing, and that was a lesson that took much longer to surface. I did not see my father cry while I was growing up. He stayed composed through years of chronic pain, financial stress, and the long adjustment after losing his career. He carried everything with a calm resilience that, as a child, felt unbreakable. It made the moment in that kitchen, years later, even more powerful. Seeing tears in his eyes did not weaken him in my mind. it widened him. It showed me that strength and vulnerability were never enemies. They were simply two parts of being human that most people are too afraid to let exist in the same room. When he apologized for getting sick, I understood something much later. He was not apologizing for the illness itself. He was apologizing for the disruption, for the grief he knew would ripple through our lives. That was how he loved. Protective, quiet, carrying responsibility, even when it was not his to carry. That moment softened something in me I had not realized, had hardened over the years. It allowed me to recognize that pushing through life did not mean shutting down emotion. It meant acknowledging it and respecting it. Faith in our home followed that same honest simplicity. My Christian upbringing meant I never had to practice my faith as a performance or obligation. Instead, my parents encouraged me to seek it out for myself and decide what it meant in the reality of my life. My father once told me church felt boring because I experienced it that way. He reminded me that faith was not entertainment. It was a personal walk, one that looked different for every individual. Standing alone in decisions is another place where I still hear echoes of him, although now it sounds like my voice. Every decision we make belongs to us. Parents do not make them. Partners do not make them. Families do not make them. Support can exist. Love can exist. But responsibility always lands in the same place. That realization does not feel heavy. It feels like clarity. Accountability belongs where it should, with the person living the life. Without it, there is no resentment when plans shift or challenges appear. The choices are mine to make, and I meet them steadily, adjusting when necessary and moving on my own terms. My father never told me to live exactly like him. In fact, his greatest act of love was telling me to leave, to return to Asia, to keep building a life that existed beyond his own. At the time, it felt like one of the hardest instructions I had ever followed. Later, I realized it was also one of the greatest gifts he ever gave me. He showed me that love does not hold people still. Love releases them forward. As my life unfolded, I would meet other men who stood at major crossroads in my story. Each of them would challenge me, balance me, and force me to confront parts of myself I might otherwise have avoided. None of them chose my direction for me. None of them carried me through life. But each of them, in peculiar ways, stood at moments where my choices became clearer, sharper, and sometimes harder. My father built the foundation. He taught me how to stand on my own feet before I ever knew I would need to. The men who came later did not replace that foundation. They also reflected the standards I had already learned to recognize without realizing it, and revealed how strong I really was. For a long time, I believed strength meant advancing without hesitation. Life would later teach me that true strength often involves knowing when to stay, when to leave, and when to rebuild something completely new. Those lessons would come through love, through loss, and through roads I never could have predicted while sitting on that couch watching late-night movies with my dad. His influence never felt like a voice telling me what to do. It felt more like a compass softly settling inside me. Life presented risks, and I leaned toward them. Life presented loss, and I acknowledged it and kept moving. Responsibility landed in my hands, and I carried it without looking for someone else to hold it for me. Many relationships, landscapes, and turning points across continents and years have shaped me. But the blueprint for how I walk through the world began long before I understood I was building a life that would stretch far beyond the place I was born. My father's life did not end with his death. It continued in the decisions he prepared me to make long after he was gone.